The photograph was a newspaper clipping, black and white, already beginning to yellow when Thomas Pruitt found it in a stack of old editions at his grandmother's house in 1984. It showed a man holding a redfish above his head, grinning for the camera at a local fishing tournament on the Gulf. The man's name was printed in small type below the photo. Thomas was 10 years old. He knew the name. He cut out the clipping with a pair of kitchen scissors and pinned it to the corkboard above his desk. It stayed there through high school. It followed him to his first apartment when he was 18. It went with him when he moved in with the woman he would marry, and she looked at it once and asked who it was, and he told her, and she never asked again. It moved with him through a divorce, through 2 more addresses, through a job change and a remarriage, and a house in Clearwater with a study that was finally his own. He pinned it to the wall in that study, above the desk where he paid his bills and read at night, and it looked down at him from the wall the way it always had. For 42 years, Thomas Pruitt woke up in a world where the man in that photograph had never been charged with anything. He kept the face up there so he would remember there was one. But to understand why Thomas Pruitt spent 42 years staring at a newspaper clipping, you have to go back to Tarpon Springs, Florida, in the early fall of 1981, and to his mother. Tarpon Springs in 1981 was a Gulf Coast town that smelled like salt water and motor oil, and on weekend mornings, like bacon from the diners on the waterfront. The Greek sponge diving community had been there since the turn of the century, and the harbor still held working boats alongside the tourist trade, sponges hanging in shop windows, cafes selling pastelli and lacumades to visitors who drove down from Tampa for the afternoon. In the residential streets set back from the water, Spanish moss hung in the live oaks and window unit air conditioners hummed through the long hot months. September was still hurricane season. The Gulf lay flat and silver in the evenings, and the air that came off it was warm and thick and carried everything in it. Diane Loretta Pruitt had moved to Tarpon Springs from Ocala in 1975, following a boyfriend who didn't last, but a job that did. She was 28 then. By 1981, she was 34, and the life she had built for herself was small, but solid and entirely her own. She worked the closing shift at the Silver Spoon Diner on US 19, a 30-seat counter and booth operation that served the truckers and the late-night crowd and the fishermen who came off the water at odd hours and needed coffee and eggs before they could sleep. She'd been there 6 years. She knew every regular by order. The year before, in the fall of 1980, she had enrolled in 2 night classes a week at St. Petersburg Junior College. She was working toward her LPN. She had put a bumper sticker on her 1974 Ford Pinto the week she enrolled, a joke she'd found at a gift shop, "Honk if you love nurses." She drove to class on Tuesday and Thursday evenings, and came home at 10 and made herself a cup of tea, and wrote notes at the kitchen table until midnight. She had circled every exam and every clinical date on the handwritten calendar she kept on the refrigerator, in red marker, so she could see at a glance what was coming. Her daughter Kay was 11 in September 1981. Her son Thomas, Tommy, was 7, small for his age, with his mother's dark eyes and the particular gravity that some quiet children carry as though they were born already paying attention. Diane got Tommy to school, then worked her shift, then picked him up from the neighbor who kept him in the afternoons, then made dinner. On class nights, a woman named Ruth Ann, who worked the early shift at the Silver Spoon, would stay with the kids. The system worked. It was the kind of life that required everything to run in order, and mostly did. Diane kissed Tommy goodnight on the evening of September 11, 1981. He was already half asleep. She tucked the sheet around his shoulders and told him she'd be home before he woke up. She had closed the diner on her own that Friday night before. Kay woke at 2 in the morning. The house was quiet in the wrong way. She walked to her mother's bedroom. The bed was made and undisturbed. She walked to the front window and looked at the driveway. The Pinto was not there. She was 11 years old. She did not call the police. She wouldn't have known how to explain it, or what to say, or what it meant. She went back to her room and sat on her bed and waited. At 6 in the morning, she walked to the neighbor's house and knocked until someone answered. Police were called at 7:15 a.m. Diane Pruitt's body was found at 9:40 a.m., less than 2 miles from the Silver Spoon, in a retention pond off a service road behind a strip mall. She had been there since the night before. Investigators began reconstructing the hours after closing. The Silver Spoon's last customer had left just after 11. Diane had locked the front door, run her till, and begun shutting off the prep equipment. A coworker who'd stopped by briefly around 10:45 confirmed she was alone. A second witness, a retired postal worker named Carl Greer, who had been parked in a lot across the road waiting for his wife to finish a late shift at a laundromat nearby, noted a truck in the Silver Spoon parking lot shortly before midnight. He described it as a dark-colored pickup. He couldn't be certain of the make. He hedged when asked about the time. The detective noted his statement, marked it uncertain, and moved on. At noon, one of the other waitresses, Ruth Ann Calloway, who had been with the Silver Spoon for years and knew every regular by name, arrived at the sheriff's department and told investigators that a man named Raymond Hebert had been in the diner until at least 10:45 that night. He was a regular. He came in most Fridays. He owned a bait and tackle shop 2 miles up the road. He had asked Diane out 3 times in the past 2 years. She had declined each time, gently, the way people in service work learn to decline in a way that keeps the regular a regular. Raymond Hebert drove a dark-colored pickup truck. The partial sample recovered from beneath Diane's thumbnail was collected during the autopsy, labeled, and sent to the Pinellas County Sheriff's Office Forensic Storage Facility. In 1981, there was no technology that could use it to identify anyone. It was cataloged and shelved. Detective Frank Odell caught the case. He was 52, a 30-year veteran, a methodical man who had worked homicides longer than he wanted to, and had learned to separate what he felt from what he could prove. He felt things about this case. He could prove very little. The first suspect pursued with any energy was a transient named Beau McCready, who had been seen sleeping behind the diner on 2 previous occasions and had a prior for breaking and entering in Hillsborough County. He was brought in and questioned for 2 days. His alibi, a shelter registration in St. Pete that placed him 40 miles away the evening of September 11th, was eventually confirmed, though it took until November. The second was Diane's former boyfriend, a man named Dennis Hoyt, who'd been in the picture briefly in 1979. He had moved to Atlanta. He was called, then visited, then cleared by corroborating accounts from his employer and 2 roommates. Raymond Hebert was interviewed on September 13th, and again on September 29th, 1981, he came in without a lawyer. He expressed grief that Odell noted as sincere in his written report. He cried, quietly, while describing what a good person Diane was, how she deserved better, how he hoped they'd find who did it. He said he'd left the diner around 10:30, maybe 10:45. He wasn't sure of the exact time, and driven home. He lived alone. No one could verify his arrival. Odell had Hebert's truck photographed as part of the general documentation. He noted in his file that Hebert had been present that evening and had no alibi for the window in question. He had no other evidence. He marked the file active and kept working. 3 days after Diane's murder, a flower arrangement was delivered to her sister's house, where Kay and Tommy were now staying. The card read, "She was a light." It was signed Raymond Hebert. Odell saw the notation. He did not follow up on it in writing. In October, Hebert attended the community vigil at the Silver Spoon parking lot. Candles, handwritten signs, a prayer offered by the pastor of the Lutheran Church on Dodecanese Boulevard. He stood in the back and wept openly. Ruth Ann Calloway, who was there, watched him from across the crowd and said nothing. By December, the case had no movement. By the following spring, it had gone cold. Frank Odell retired in 1989. He died in 2004. The case file was transferred twice more over the decades, landing eventually in a storage system that was digitized only partially, with the physical materials boxed and held at the Pinellas County Sheriff's Office facility in Largo. Carl Greer went home to his family. He had a wife and 3 children and a full life ahead of him, and Sonny Hebert, everyone called him Sonny, was the kind of man who had friends everywhere, who knew people, who would remember the face of someone who'd caused him trouble. Carl told himself he hadn't seen anything clearly enough to matter. He told himself that for a long time. Tommy was 7 when his mother didn't come home. He was 8 when he understood, in the way that children understand catastrophic things, that she was never going to. He was 10 when he found the newspaper clipping. He was 16 when Ruth Ann Calloway, who still worked at the Silver Spoon, who still thought about Diane every Friday night when she worked the closing shift alone, pulled him aside after a school fundraiser and said quietly, "The way people say things they have carried too long and can no longer quite hold. I always thought it was Sonny Hebert. I don't know if that helps you or hurts you, but I thought you should know there's a name." Tommy already knew the name. He had been staring at it for 6 years. Kay graduated in 1988 and stayed in Pinellas County. Tommy graduated the same year and moved to his first apartment in Clearwater, taking with him 2 garbage bags of clothes, a second-hand mattress, and a newspaper clipping pinned carefully between 2 pieces of cardboard so it wouldn't bend in transit. He found work in construction, then in property maintenance, eventually in project management for a mid-sized building firm. He married in 1997. He told his wife Cheryl about his mother on their second date, because he had learned by then that it was not the kind of thing you could introduce gradually. Cheryl asked if he'd ever come close to knowing who had done it, and he told her about the clipping on the wall, and she looked at it for a long time without saying anything, and then she asked him if he wanted to keep it up, and he said yes, and she said okay. The fishing tournament clipping had gone brittle at the edges by then. The ink faded from black to a grayish-brown. Tommy had kept it in a frame after the first move, behind glass, so the paper wouldn't continue to deteriorate. Sonny Hebert grinned out from behind that glass, the redfish raised above his head, frozen in a moment of ordinary triumph. By 1997, Hebert had expanded the bait and tackle shop and was known throughout the county as a fixture of the Gulf fishing community. He served as treasurer for the local Rotary chapter. He organized an annual charity tournament that raised money for the Children's Hospital. He was 62 years old, well-liked, aging gracefully into the kind of community elder that small Gulf Coast towns produce and are grateful for. Tommy drove past his shop sometimes. Not often. He did not go inside. In 2001, Tommy and Cheryl divorced. No catastrophic reason, simply a gradual growing apart. The clipping went with Tommy to a rented house in Dunedin. In 2009, Kay was diagnosed with ovarian cancer. She died 14 months later. Tommy sat with her at the end and held her hand, and afterward drove to his house and sat in his study for a long time looking at the clipping on the wall. Kay was the last person alive who remembered their mother before the case. Now, it was just him. In 2022, Raymond Hebert's wife of 35 years died of a stroke. She was buried at the Greek Orthodox Church in Tarpon Springs. Hebert, now 80 years old, did not appear in public for several months afterward. In a house in St. Petersburg, an 81-year-old retired postal worker named Carl Greer watched the obituary notice pass through his Facebook feed and sat with something he had been carrying for 41 years. Every case like this one represents a family that never stopped. A son who kept a face on his wall. A sister who died still waiting. A woman who whispered a name because she couldn't carry it alone anymore. If the work of telling these stories matters to you, please take a second to like this video and subscribe. Leave a comment and tell us where in the world you're watching from. Your presence here is what makes it possible to keep going. Now let's get back to Diane. Detective Marisol Vega had been with the Pinellas County Cold Case Unit for 3 years when she pulled Diane Pruitt's file in the spring of 2023. She was 39, precise and unhurried, the kind of investigator who read case files the way others read novels, looking for what wasn't said as carefully as what was. She had requested the case herself after reviewing the unit's backlog and flagging it as having preserved biological evidence and an unresolved primary interview subject who was still alive. She was 2 days into her initial review when she received a call from a retired postal worker named Carl Greer, who said he had seen something posted in a local Tarpon Springs history group on Facebook. Someone asking what people remembered about the Silver Spoon Diner, and it had been enough. Vega set down her coffee. She did not pick up her pen for the first 40 seconds of that call. Carl Greer described, in the careful and specific way of a man who has rehearsed something 10,000 times, a dark-colored pickup truck, a Ford F-100. He was sure of the model now. He'd looked it up at some point over the years, in the Silver Spoon parking lot at 11:45 p.m. On September 11, 1981, after closing, he had written down the license plate on a Texaco receipt he kept in his glove box, because he was a careful man, because something about the timing felt wrong. He had kept that receipt for over a decade before throwing it away, he said. But he had never forgotten the number. The plate matched a vehicle registered to Raymond Hebert. Vega picked up her pen. She also requested a reanalysis of the biological material recovered from beneath Diane Pruitt's thumbnail. Forensic genealogy, the process of uploading crime scene DNA to public ancestry databases and tracing distant relatives backward to identify an unknown contributor, had become an accepted investigative tool in Florida in 2019. The sample, properly stored in Largo since 1981, yielded a viable profile. The analysis took 11 weeks. In late August 2023, a match emerged through GEDmatch, a cluster of distant relatives that traced carefully through 3 generations and confirmed through 3 separate family branches, converged on a single man. Raymond Hebert. Vega called Thomas Pruitt on a Tuesday afternoon in September 2023. He was sitting in the cab of his truck outside a hardware store in Clearwater. He had his phone to his ear and the window down and the Gulf Coast heat coming in off the asphalt. She told him they had a DNA match. She told him they had a witness. She told him the name. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then, quietly, "You're sure?" It wasn't a question. Raymond Hebert was 80 years old when the Pinellas County Sheriff's deputies pulled up to his house on a Wednesday morning in October 2023. He had lived in the same neighborhood for 30 years. His truck, a newer model now, the same dark color, was in the driveway. The roses he'd planted along the front walk were just beginning to go brown for the season. He had cried at Diane Pruitt's community vigil. He had sent flowers to her children. He had attended Ruth Ann Calloway's retirement party from the Silver Spoon in 2007 and made a toast to absent friends. He had lived in the same county for 42 years, accessible, visible, well-regarded, comfortable, in the understanding that the past had been adequately buried. His neighbor across the street came to the window when she heard the vehicles. She had lived there for 12 years and thought she knew him well. She stood at her window and watched, and could not reconcile what she was seeing with what she knew. And then realized that the reconciliation was the story. Hebert's daughter arrived as the deputies were walking him to the patrol car. She stood in the doorway of his house and said, quietly, to no one in particular, "This isn't real." Raymond Hebert said nothing. He looked straight ahead. He had been saying nothing, in a legal sense, for 42 years, and the habit held. He was charged with first-degree murder in the death of Diane Loretta Pruitt. He was held without bail. He entered a not guilty plea at his arraignment. He sat at the defendant's table and did not look at the gallery, where Thomas Pruitt sat in the third row in a clean button-down shirt, holding a folded piece of paper in his hands. The men who had fished with Hebert for 30 years. The people who had donated to his charity tournament. The women from the church who had brought him casseroles after his wife died. They processed the news the way that communities process these things. First disbelief, then the retroactive inventory, then the slow and uncomfortable reckoning with what they had not let themselves see. Ruth Ann Calloway, who was 79 and still lived in Tarpon Springs, was told by her granddaughter, who found her sitting at the kitchen table afterward, very still. "I knew," Ruth Ann said. "I knew, and I was afraid, and I stayed afraid too long." The flower arrangement, the vigil, the 31 years of good deeds in clear public view. Raymond Hebert had understood, intuitively, that the best place to hide was in the gratitude of the community he had devastated. He had banked on that gratitude, renewed it annually, and let it accumulate interest. For 42 years, it had been enough. It was not enough anymore. On the morning after the arraignment, Thomas Pruitt went to his study. He stood in front of the wall for a moment. The clipping was behind glass now, in a small frame he'd bought at a craft store in 1994 when the paper had started to curl at the edges. The frame was nothing special. Plain black, inexpensive, it had done its job. He took it down. He held it for a moment. Sonny Hebert grinned up at him, the redfish raised, the gulf behind him, the summer of 1984 frozen in newsprint that had gone the color of old bone. Then Tommy set it in a box he would take to the Pinellas County Sheriff's Office, because they had asked him to bring anything he had. And he had had this for 42 years, and it was time for it to go somewhere else. "I kept his face up there," he told a reporter outside the courthouse, "so I'd remember there was a face. Now everybody knows the face." The Pinellas County Sheriff's Office expanded its participation in Florida's statewide cold case initiative following the resolution of Diane Pruitt's case. With particular attention to biological material collected before 1990 and held in storage without analysis, Carl Greer, 81 years old, issued a brief written statement through his family saying that he was sorry it had taken so long and that he hoped the Pruitt family could find some peace. Tommy called him. The call lasted an hour. There is a kind of knowledge that the law cannot act on, a kind of certainty that has no standing in any court, that earns you nothing, that no one can take from you and no one can use. Thomas Pruitt carried that kind of knowledge for 42 years. He found a face in a newspaper and kept it on his wall not out of obsession, not out of vengeance, but out of a refusal to participate in the forgetting. He was 7 years old when his mother did not come home. He understood, even then, even at 7, that the world was asking him to let it become something that had simply happened, to let it settle into the past the way all things eventually settle. He refused. Not loudly, not dramatically. He just kept the face on the wall and got up every morning and lived his life and waited for the world to finally catch up to what he already knew. It did. 42 years later, in the hands of a detective who understood what it meant to wait, and an old man who decided at 81 that he was done being afraid, and a database that held the record of a man who had thought biology would stay silent. The truth is patient in a way that people are not always able to be. But Thomas Pruitt was patient enough. I want to hear what you think about this case. Tommy kept that photograph on his wall for 42 years. Was that an act of hope, or grief, or something in between that doesn't have a name? And what do you make of Carl Greer, who saw something and stayed quiet for 4 decades, and then didn't? Is that a story about fear, or about courage, or both at once? And Raymond Hebert, who sent flowers to the children of the woman he killed, and wept at her vigil, and built 30 years of goodwill on top of what he'd done. What does it take to live like that? What does a community owe the people it trusted to completely? Justice found Diane Pruitt after 42 years. And her son, who knew there was a face long before the law did, finally got to put the photograph down. If stories like this one matter to you, stories about the people who refuse to let the truth stay buried, subscribe so you don't miss the next case. More are waiting in the description. Thank you for being here.